In this contribution to the Warwick Faculty of Arts at Home series, I want to reflect on the renewed significance of British television's long entanglement with home crafts in this period of lockdown, which is also a period of our intensified, conflicted and reorganised relationship with domestic space. I've written before about the long history of British television programming that's been focused on the traditionally feminine domestic arts of cookery, sewing and home decoration, ranging from the early programmes hosted by Marguerite Patten in the 1940s and 1950s, right through to the Great British Sewing Bee. I've argued that early television played an important part in reconstructing ideal notions of British femininity in the post-war period, because it included these traditionally feminine arts in items alongside features on politics and the higher arts, which acknowledge women's public and professional roles in the world outside. This kind of programming has continued to be one of the ways in which audiovisual culture has participated subtly in ongoing negotiations around gender and the home into the present, through makeover shows in the 90s like Style Challenge and Changing Rooms, through to the Great British Bake Off, the Great British Sewing Bee, and even Repair Shop, which directly precedes Sewing Bee in the current linear schedule on BBC One on a Wednesday night. In the late 90s, content like this, which was understood as feminised, moved from daytime television into the primetime schedule, and that was one of the ways in which a shifting address in that material to a less specifically gendered audience was signalled, and the presence of programming about lifestyle, leisure, craft, such as the many programmes hosted by Kirsty Allsop, for example, and most recently shows about baking and sewing, their significance and their presence in the British television schedule has persisted, and they've become event television. So now it's May 2020, and during lockdown in the COVID-19 pandemic, both television as the medium, but also in its literal meaning of distant vision, and the domestic arts have been foregrounded in a number of ways which speak to the historical and contemporary entwined importance of television and the domestic arts in the life of the nation. So television was envisaged as a two-way medium of communication, and for more on this you could see Geoffrey Sconcer's wonderful book Haunted Media. But it developed predominantly as a unidirectional form, although eventually with phone-ins and tweeting and other forms of interactivity. Scholars of television, though, have always pointed to the ways in which television blurs the line between public and private, the ways in which television offers a window on the world, but also brings the world out there into the home through news and travel shows. Conversely, it also makes the private and the personal public through soap operas, talk shows, and other programmes. At present, these boundaries, which television has always had the potential to cross, have for many of us been irrefutably dissolved, with effects which bring the hierarchised, temporalised and often gendered organisation of the spaces of the home into flux. Lots of us are working from home now, using video conferencing apps for teaching and for meeting with students and colleagues. And in these encounters, our previously hidden personal and family spaces are suddenly revealed. And with them come a set of new decisions to be made. Should I find a blank wall as a background? Should I blur my background? If I sit in the kitchen or the bedroom or the dining room, what's going to be revealed about my tastes and my status? What if I don't have a quiet home office, which I don't, for example? And what if my partner or parent or roommate or pet or child is seen or heard? Will I be perceived as deeply unprofessional? For women in particular, for most of whom the post-feminist impetus to have it all in terms of family and career has always been an almost impossible tension, the current situation has brought this conflict into sharp focus. In 1986, feminist cultural historian Rosemary Dean argued in her book All Work and No Play that even after the women's movement, the home typically remained a space of work for women, but of leisure for men. In lockdown, the home is now a space of work and of leisure for everyone. In lockdown, as in television, what happened outside has come inside, and the pressure on domestic space, particularly for those of us who live in small spaces, is significant. The table is needed for eating, but also for homeschooling, and also possibly for more than one adult's paid work. Previously, in my house at least, the fact that most of the household was outside the home for much of the week meant that the use of the main table in the house was invisibly, automatically, and reflexively used for different things at different times. Negotiations over degrees of need and priorities of task must now take place. In lockdown, needs and uses that are usually separated have crashed together. So there's been a rearranging of public and private in relation to domestic space, one which speaks directly to television's long-standing role in the home, and a negotiation over priorities for time and for use of space in the home in relation to the pandemic lockdown. In this reorganised space and time, both television and home working, the domestic arts, have enjoyed their own and related reordering. First then, television. In the landscape of digital television and streamed content on demand, there's been a bemoaning of a loss of simultaneous common viewing experience, what we call co-presence in television studies, the nation watching broadcast, or now linear, programmes at the same time. Of course, we've always found ways to share the experience of live viewing through texting and through social media, for example, in that new landscape. But in the time of social distancing, it's become even more important to find ways to watch together in separation, a principle that's at the heart of public service broadcasting. This has happened, for example, through the introduction of Netflix Party, which lets you watch at the same time as someone far away whilst chatting through a conversation pane on the right-hand side of the screen. People are also finding ways to use to watch and connect with friends and family, so play games together, go to the virtual pub, through the video conferencing apps that we use for work. And in this way, television seems to have returned to its early intention to provide a two-way interface like the telephone, only with vision. Here again then, the public and the private, the professional and the personal are merging in lockdown through the small screen. The urge to find ways to connect across social distance has undoubtedly been stoked by the recourse to rhetoric around World War II, through talk of pulling together, victory over the virus, being all in it together, clapping for the NHS, and of course a World War II veteran raising millions by walking with his frame around his garden. One aspect of that idiom has been the way in which both professional and home dressmakers have formed an army of sewers to make thousands of masks, ear protectors and scrubs for friends and relatives and for an underfunded NHS, complete with a poster featuring Rosie the Riveter in a mask as we sew for victory over the virus. Elastic and cotton twill fabric are suddenly in short supply, as the home front has entered into battle. But there are also other forms of handicraft which have been highlighted, as well as sewing, knitting and crocheting of ear protectors, for example, but also home baking. Supermarket shelves and online shops have been emptied of flour and yeast as the nation has turned to bread and cake making, both for distraction, but also for a feeling of productivity and usefulness, I suspect, rather than actual need, because bread and cakes are still widely available. In the WhatsApp group for my Scrub Hub team, we've all shared stories of the importance of sewing, baking and other crafts for our mental health, and have talked about the pleasures we've found in a programme like the Great British Sewing Bee, which has reminded the wider society and even introduced some people to the possibility of making their own clothes to a professional standard. And in the past few years, I've seen increasing numbers of younger colleagues and students learning this most traditional of domestic skills, often as a response to high street fast fashion. As I noted when writing about the makeover takeover in the 1990s, at that moment there was an accompanying and distinct regendering going on as men became subjects of fashion and women mastered power tools on television in making over themselves and their homes. Similarly, the skill and science of baking has been illuminated and has regained popularity through the Great British Bake Off, and has also encouraged a new generation to bake from scratch with the children's version on CBBC and the somewhat less gendered address of contemporary cooking and sewing shows. Domestic arts items on early daytime television and in the hobbyist programmes of the 60s and 70s, as my colleague Charlotte Brunsdon has written, were focused on teaching a skill. So, for example, creaming butter and sugar together or making a buttonhole. And they utilised the grammar of the close-up to show us how to do that. Following 1990s makeover television, however, the focus of home crafts on television shifted really resolutely in the age of the docusoap and reality television to a rhetoric of melodrama, where the close-up now shows the tears of the ordinary person on television, produced by a sunken souffle or an unfinished hem. Contemporary domestic arts on television only cursorily attend to the skills required to make, and they focus our attention instead on the emotional power of personal failure or success. Despite this change in the aesthetic grammar of contemporary domestic arts programming, for those of us who've always been invested in the domestic arts, lockdown is an interesting time. Our personal, minority, perhaps even old-fashioned passions and skills have become public and valuable, shared on social media, reported on television, as the potential of the now proliferate small screen to blur the boundaries between public and private, professional and personal has been demonstrated. This has happened through a renewed attention to traditionally feminine skills, which were once a necessity rather than a pursuit for leisure or mindfulness. And that's not to suggest that there haven't always been professional public women cooks and seamstresses, or indeed men who sewed and cooked at home. Some have been in a position to use opportunities afforded by the necessity of lockdown and homeschooling to introduce children to these traditional skills, either for fun or under the guise of science or art in the curriculum. And the renewed focus on these skills during social distancing has brought a heightened significance to the event status of shows like Repair Shop, Sewing Bee, and no doubt Bake Off. Where I've previously argued that the competitiveness of dressmaking on the Great British Sewing Bee is really weird compared to how we actually sew, now as I'm racing to sew scrubs to order in any spare minute, the pressure of game show sewing on television has entered the home, and the hectic pace of the Sewing Bee suddenly makes sense to me. The importance of the BBC as our main public service broadcaster has also been reiterated in the recognition that live and linear radio and television and the feelings of co-presence or togetherness in separation that they deliver are vital for the well-being of those self-isolating and shielding, and that's been demonstrated in the decision to delay changes to the licence fee for those over 75. So while the echoes of wartime Britain being enhanced as I record this by plans for socially distant but synchronised celebration of the 75th anniversary of VE Day are no doubt problematic, the discourse around togetherness, community, sharing and making, as well as watching together simultaneously, can only be welcome. As life eventually settles back into something akin to our former reality, I hope that the recognition that we've seen being paid to skills and arts associated predominantly with women and with the home in this period of refigured time and space will prove not to be fleeting, but, like the prime time television that celebrates dramas of making and baking, persistent. Thank you.